lesson, we looked at how to create multiple forms, and we created a main form that then called 4 different child forms. So one for George Washington, one for Thomas Jefferson, one for Theodore Roosevelt, and one for Abraham Lincoln. What I want to be able to do now is be able to send data back from this form, from maybe the Lincoln form or the Roosevelt form, back to our main form on Mount Rushmore. And we use something called static variables to make that happen. So to be able to see that data, I'm going to add another label. I'm going to name this label LBL data. And then I'm going to go to my form C# code, and at the very top, above our constructor for the form, I'm going to add in a class level variable. And I'm just going to call it shared data. It's going to be of type string. And I'm going to have it initially equal click a button to view information about each president. And then in the form 1, after we have initialized the components, I'm simply going to say LBL data dot text equals shared data. And so if we test this, we get our label down here that says click a button to view information about each president. I'm going to make that a little bit lighter, kind of like my copyright information here. So it's just kind of faint. I'm going to go back to design, select that label, and change the for color to just a dark gray or gray. Okay, so what we're going to have happen now when I open any of the president forms is to display, when we close that form, the last form that was viewed. So I'm going to come back to my C# code. In order to do that, we're going to use this variable in sharing that data between the forms. But in order for the other forms to be able to access this variable, I need to make it public so it can be accessed outside of this class, because each of those other forms are a different class. But then I also need to make it static. So I'm going to add those two modifiers. So it's public static string. The static modifier means that this variable or this field is shared amongst all instances of the class. And this allows us to maintain that variable data as long as this form is running, even while other forms have the focus. I'm going to go down to our show president, where we show the dialog, and I want to demonstrate two things. I'm going to set LBL data.text is going to equal xyz.toString. That's going to be the name of the form that we're using has been called. So I'm going to just demonstrate that we're calling another form in that data. And then we're going to show our dialog. And that dialog of XYZ creates another thread, and so until we close that dialog, none of this other code after it runs. But when that's done, we're going to say again LBL data dot text equals, and we'll take our variable of shared data. Got my semicolon there. So I'm just going to run this again. And actually, before I run this, I just realized I made a slight mistake here. I want xyz.toString. I want the name of the form, and then concatenate has been called. All right, let me test this. So when I click the Washington button, it brings up the Washington form, and you'll see that it shows here 07A multiple form demo form Washington dot text George Washington has been called. So it's kind of a long list there of that object to a string. But watch what happens when I close this form. Now we're going back to that shared data. All right, so you can see that information here is changing. Now I'm going to come back, and I really don't need to see that form being called here. I'm going to comment that out. I'm going to go to my Washington form. So we have our initialized component for Washington. form1 dot, and when I get the properties and the methods for form1 here, notice I get a shared data static string variable access. So I can use that and say form1 dot shared data equals, and we'll just say Washington was the last form viewed. Add my semicolon. Now remember, when we're in the Washington form, our main form is kind of in limbo at that point. But as soon as we go back to our main form, we're going to see that last line of code in form1cs of our show presently executed, where we're going to set lbl-data.text to shared data. Let's try this. So I go to Washington. Nothing has changed here, but when I close Washington, it tells me Washington was the last form viewed. I can do the same thing with Jefferson. I'm going to first just copy that line of code from Washington. I'm going to go to Jefferson, and I'm going to paste that in and change Washington to Jefferson. Do the same thing for Roosevelt. And then also do the same thing for Lincoln. I'm going to test my program. So there we get Washington was the last form viewed. Jefferson was the last form viewed. Roosevelt was the last form viewed. And then finally, Lincoln was the last form viewed. So I'm passing data from those additional forms back to my main form. Now I want to go the other way. I want to pass data from this form to one of those other forms. And I'm just going to do Roosevelt as an example. I'm going to go to our Roosevelt design mode. I'm going to take another label. I'm going to call this LBL quote. And I'm going to change the font to be oblique. So this gives us an italicized font. I'm going to make it a little bit larger, maybe 9 point. And I'm going to change the for color to blue. And let's just change the text here to quote goes here. We really won't see that because we're going to pass a quote to this to be displayed in this form. So I'm going to go back to the code for Roosevelt, and we're just going to say LBL quote dot text equals, I'm going to do a literal string of backslash double quote inside of double quotes. So that way we're creating an escape character of the quote. Plus, we're going to do a variable called quote plus another backslash quote inside of quotes. So the quote we pass it, we're going to put inside of quotes in that label, my semicolon. And then in my constructor here, this creates an instance of the form. I can create a parameter here of a string. I'm just going to call it quote. And this should be quote here. So the quote that I pass it, when I create the instance, is what's going to be displayed in that LBL quote. Now I need to go back to my main form, to its code. And notice that now when I'm calling form Roosevelt, they get a little squiggly here, and it says there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter quote of form Roosevelt. So I need to pass it a quote here. And so probably his most famous quote was, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." I'm going to pass it that as a literal string. It's expecting a string. It could have been a string variable value. We're going to pass a literal string. I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to go back to my design of Roosevelt. Let's center that quote. So I'm going to take the text align and just simply center it. And so what I need to do then is to take that label, set the auto size to false, and make sure it's enough that I can get 2 lines in that. And that's kind of centered here between the margins. All right, let's go back and run our program. So when I click Roosevelt, I'm going to pass it that quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," to that Roosevelt form as part of its constructor. So when it creates the form, it then puts that quote in LVL quote as it initializes the components. So we can use the constructors to pass data to another form when that instance is created. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the C# Xamarin Programming Cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.